Today we have Dr. Joel Anderson, who graduated with a BS in Education in English Literature, and then went on to get a Master's in Theological Studies, another Master in Old Testament, and eventually a PhD in Old Testament. He is an author, blogger, and adjunct Old Testament instructor at the University of North Alabama. His blog, Resurrecting Orthodoxy, encompasses a wide range of topics, from biblical studies, church history, theology, culture, and social issues, as well as things like literature and poetry. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Anderson. Okay, well, tell us about your experience teaching high school. Maybe first give us a little bit of background on you growing up and your academic background and family background and spiritual background, just so we kind of know where you're coming from.
And you don't need to mention the Cubs. Yeah.
Well, okay. I'll see how. I kind of jotted some basic life things down for me. I grew up. Nobody knows where Carroll Stream, Illinois is, so I just say Wheaton. Wheaton College. My parents went to Wheaton College. That's where they met. I grew up in the Wheaton area. I went to Assemblies of God Church growing up, Calvary Temple in Naperville. I went to Wheaton Christian High School. So I kind of grew up in the 70s and 80s in kind of the heart of evangelicalism. And so in that sense, I grew up in a Christian home. I think at the time, I didn't realize how lucky I was to have sane, level-headed parents. And what I mean by that is, my parents were, conservative and evangelical, and but they were public school teachers, and they were thoughtful, and they never got swept up into some of the more crazy things that went on in evangelicalism, whether it was end-time speculation or young earth creationism or even like the moral majority religious right. We knew they were in there, but my parents never were bonkers in those areas. So I just always assumed that, most Christians and most evangelicals are kind of level-headed and sane like my parents, which isn't necessarily the case all the time, as I've learned as I've grown older. But that being said, I kind of grew up in, evangelical, Christian setting. I had and so in that sense, I was a Christian all my life. But for me, I consider the time I really started to make Christianity for myself is the summer after my junior year in high school. During my 11th grade year, I'd gotten into a car wreck, and when you're a kid, you have a traumatic experience like that. You think about life more. Long story short, in the summer between my junior and senior year, I kind of thought through my faith. I read Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. I was very influenced by Sting's Dream of the Blue Turtles album. It sounds weird, but that had a major effect on the shaping of my faith. And I kind of made Christianity my own during that time. I went through college. I went to Northwest Missouri State University and got a bachelor's degree in English literature, got a teaching degree. Early 20s, I joined the Peace Corps. I was in Kazakhstan for a year teaching English as a foreign language. I eventually went out to Regent College in Vancouver in the mid-90s and did a master's degree in New Testament studies. And then I taught for my first 4 years as a full-time teacher in California at a small Christian school there. After those 4 years, I went back to Trinity Western University in Langley, British Columbia, and I did a master's degree in Old Testament. And from there, I got a job in Little Rock, Arkansas at yet another small Christian high school there. And I taught there for 4 years. I started a PhD program through the University of Pretoria. So I was working full time as I was doing the PhD program for a number of years. And then something happened at that school, which we'll probably talk about later. And I ended up in Alabama, and I taught at a small Christian school in Alabama for 8 years, teaching biblical worldview. all my teaching in high school was either English or biblical worldview stuff. And then at the end of my time at the small Christian school here in Alabama, I'm now an adjunct biblical studies, religious studies instructor at the University of North Alabama. And so that's kind of a little bit about my background in general. So
I'm just curious. I'm just curious. With your background at the Christian schools, was that purposeful? Did you avoid the public school because they were demonic, or I mean, what was your purpose for that? Was it too secular? Yeah.
No. My parents were public school teachers. I mean, so when I graduated college, at 21 with a English teaching degree, I looked like Doogie Howser. I looked like I was 16 and I couldn't get a job to save my life. That's why I joined the Peace Corps. I was just I substitute taught for 2 years and it put a bullet through your head other than subbing. And so it was when I was in Kazakhstan, I kind of had an epiphany that I've always loved biblical study things. Okay. Even, growing up, I was just always fascinated with it. And so when I was in Kazakhstan, I decided I'm going to take 2 years and get a master's degree in biblical studies. Even if I don't do anything with it, I want to learn it just to learn it, And so after Regent College, and I had no plans on being a college professor or anything. What I wanted to do, especially after Regent College, because when I went to Regent College and started learning, taking biblical studies classes, one of the things I remember distinctly thinking about was, because I went to a Christian high school and took Bible classes in, Christian high school. And what I learned at Regent College, it wasn't, there was some academic stuff that was high level beyond high school, but a lot of it was just basic biblical understanding that I remember thinking, why wasn't I taught this in high school? This isn't that hard to understand. Most high school Bible classes were always, the equivalent of like personal devotions, but you didn't really learn biblical studies, which I think is kind of important. And so after Regent College, what I decided I really wanted to do with my career was to take what I learned at the graduate level with biblical studies and make it understandable to high school kids, kind of like to develop biblical Bible study classes that I wish I had had in high school. And obviously you can't really do that in public schools. So given what I wanted to do, my only avenue was kind of Christian schools. And so that's how I ended up teaching Christian schools, is because I wanted to take what I learned at the graduate level and make it understandable to, people who aren't going to get master's degrees in biblical studies, because that's really needed. Because I think what I've come to see is at the college level and graduate level, you have all these academics who know all the information and they write great books. But even if they try to write for the common people, they're way up here. It's really hard to communicate at that level. And so having taught in high school for 16 years, trying to do that, you learn you have to do that. You just learn to do that. And I don't think a lot of people can. Does that make sense?
Oh, completely. Completely.
To your question, that's how I ended up teaching in evangelical Christian schools. Is I kind of wanted to do I wanted to develop Bible courses that I wish I had when I was in high school, because it's not done that often. Most high school level Bible curriculums are horrible. And so,
wish I could get something like that for my kids. That was something we were talking about recently. I wish our church had some sort of a better Bible program for high school as well.
Well, it's not I'm not to sound mean, but most even churches in Christian schools, they don't know how to do it. It was kind of like when I taught for 16 years, every week we'd have chapel, because you're a Christian school, you have chapel. And I remember talking with the headmaster, who was a friend of mine, and we were talking like, can we do chapel better? We have to have chapel, but nobody knew how to do chapel. It was always kind of the same thing, and they never knew how to do that, communicate. And so I don't know. It's always been it's a tough thing. So yeah.
All right. So when you were growing up, did you participate in the science faith dialogue? What did your family talk about with that? You weren't a really sciencey kind of person. How did you get to the point where you were involved with the science faith dialogue?
Well, that's a good question, and that'll be I'll expand on that. Yeah, when I was growing up, neither of my parents were into science, and I wasn't into science, and maybe it was because I was so not into science growing up, I didn't even realize there was that big of an issue. Growing up in evangelicalism, you were taught that evolution is bad and not true. A secular conspiracy and whatnot. But, and it's strange as it may sound, at that time in high school, I didn't care. It wasn't my thing. And so I never was concerned about the creation evolution debate. Having gone, grade school and junior high, public schools, we had science classes. And it was one of those things when you're a kid, if you would have asked me when I was a kid, I believe in Adam and Eve and they were historical people and all those early chapters, I would have said, oh yeah, that's historical, sure. But at the same time, having the science classes I did have, I'm like, well, obviously dinosaurs were millions of years ago. I didn't put the two together. I didn't think it was being a kid, you don't sense the contradiction there. So it just wasn't a big deal for me. And then moving ahead, when I was an adult at Regent College doing biblical studies, I started, doing a little research on the early chapters of Genesis. I'll name drop right here. My first semester at Regent College, I took a course from J.I. Packer, a systematic theology course, and I did a paper on the doctrine of original sin. So that gets you into the Genesis chapters, early Genesis chapters. And as I researched them and studied, and for my paper, being a literature major, I started realizing, hey, this doesn't read like a historical narrative. There's other things going on here. And so that got me into how do I interpret Genesis 1 through 11. And that was, late 90s. Before I even cared about the creation evolution debate, I had already come to the conclusion that I did not think Genesis 1 through 11 was meant to be read as historical. Okay. The M word, mythological literature. I came to see that the first 11 chapters was that. Being a literature major, I recognized genres. And when I studied it, I'm like, oh, this clearly is in the genre of ancient Near Eastern mythological literature. It's doing different things and it's kind of subverting ancient Near Eastern myth in that worldview, but it's still in that genre. And so in the late 90s, that's how I came to the conclusion of Genesis 1 through 11. But if you would have asked me in the late 90s if I accepted evolution, I would have said, well, no, because I hadn't even dealt with that issue yet. After Regent College, when I got my first job at the school in California, and this is how naive I was. I had just done this biblical studies program at Regent College, and I was teaching at this new school, teaching mostly English classes, but I also taught some Bible classes. And the Bible curriculum they had wasn't that good. And so they allowed me the second year to develop my own Bible courses. And so I thought, well, as a high school kid, what would be really interesting to study? I thought, the book of Revelation. And so, but I taught it as not the Tim LaHaye Left Behind version thing. It was, how would you understand Revelation in the first century? Understand it in the original context, because that's what you learn in biblical studies. That's how you do it. And so I put together a course on Revelation, but I started it with a month going through Genesis 1 through 11, because at the very end of Revelation, there are a whole bunch of connections to Genesis 1 through 11. So kind of teach the beginning and the end in one course. And in that unit, that Genesis 1 through 11 unit that I did, as naive as I was, I just kind of came out with worksheets and assignments and, Genesis 1 through 11 is ancient Near Eastern mythological literature. Obviously. And I didn't realize that people would freak out over that. And I started teaching it, and there was like 3 students in my class who just freaked out that I dared to say that. And it was very contentious with these 3 students. And what ended up happening, though, is numerous class times that I would be teaching something, they would get mad, and they would, at the end of the class, they would storm out. And as a young teacher, you're thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to get in trouble. But after they would storm out, everybody else in that class, whether right after class or during lunch, they would come up to me privately and they would say, I'm so glad we're going over this stuff because I've always had questions about this. It never made sense, and now it makes sense. I can make sense of Genesis 1 through 11. And when we went through Revelation, one of the best compliments I ever had as a teacher was, hey, I'm not scared of Revelation anymore. I actually understand it. And so that experience in California kind of boosted my confidence that, hey, I can teach this stuff and people will, most kids will be thankful that we've gone through it. Now, given that, fast forward to my time, then when I went to Little Rock, the school in Little Rock, their worldview unit had a unit where their junior worldview class had a unit where they compared Genesis 1 through 11 to Greek mythology. And we talked it over as a worldview department. And I suggested, if you're going to compare Genesis 1 through 11 to any kind of mythology, compare it to ancient Near Eastern mythology. And they all agreed. So I said, I've actually put together this unit from my old school. I'll give it to everybody, and you kind of use it however you want. It just so happened that my last year there was a new headmaster and a new principal who got wind of what we were doing in the worldview department. And I didn't do it by myself. We kind of discussed it at all. And they kind of made me the scapegoat. And they basically forced me out of the school after that year, all because of this Genesis 1 through 11 unit. And I couldn't understand why they were, that's a strong reaction to get rid of a teacher. And so, but even that, it was more that I dared suggest Genesis 1 through 11 had connections with ancient Near Eastern mythology. But even then, the creation evolution issue didn't come up. It was just Genesis 1 through 11. Then, after that, I got a job here in Alabama at this school where I took over the whole biblical worldview department, and I made courses from freshmen to seniors. And in the senior worldview, after a couple of years, it was probably 2008. Do you remember the Ben Stein movie Expelled? It was the intelligent design movie.
Yeah, I loved it when it first came out, and then after reading Francis Collins' book, I was convicted.
Exactly. That was the movie. I think it was in 2008 or 2009. Maybe 2009. That it came out, and I really liked it, and that movie inspired me to say, hey, in my senior worldview class, because we have a Freud unit and a Marx unit, and those are bad people, let's have a Darwin unit, and we're going to show them that Darwin is wrong. That was my motivation for doing my Darwin unit. And so I put it together, and the more I researched it and talked to some people, gradually over the course of a couple of years, I already didn't think Genesis 1 through 11 was historical. I had come to that conclusion, 15 years before. And so the more I studied it, the more I kind of started saying, yeah, I think the evolution is true. I didn't say that in class because as a teacher, my job is to let's lay out the different views and discuss them. That's what you do in worldview class. And so I kind of had, this is what atheistic evolution, like Richard Dawkins, this is what he says. And this is what theistic evolution, like Francis Collins says. And then this is what young earth creationists like Ken Ham said. I kind of put out all the different views. And what we would do is we would discuss them. I try to show some kind of video for each one, and it was more of a discussion-oriented unit. And so that's how I did the unit. But beyond doing that unit, I really didn't get into that issue that much. Then in when was it? When did the Bill Nye Ken Ham debate happen? Was it 2013? Something like that? 2013, 14?
Yes, I think 14, I think.
It was around that time.
Yeah.
At that time, at that school, a new principal, the one who did not hire me, a new principal headmaster came in, and I didn't know it at the time, but he was like a hardcore young earth creationist zealot. And so when the Ham-Nye debate came on, I watched it, and I had an earlier blog called Resurrected Orthodoxy. It was a very small thing. And I decided, hey, I'm going to write a series on this and kind of analyze the debate. And so I did, I don't know how many posts I did, but I did a number of posts where I analyzed the debate, and I basically made it clear that I just don't think Ken Ham is necessarily right. I'm not saying the Bible isn't right. I think he is interpreting it wrong. And I was pretty even-handed. So long story short, because of that, over the course of the next year, the headmaster concluded that I was leading children astray, that I was a wolf in sheep's clothing. We had a lot of back and forth emails, and he was pretty nasty. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I could go into that it hurts, and I couldn't understand why he was doing this because, again, I was kind of naive and I didn't understand how controversial this whole thing was. Mm-hmm. Once he let me know that he was not going to renew my contract, that's when I thought, maybe I should read more up on this Ken Ham guy. And so I got on the Answers in Genesis website and I started reading his articles, and I was horrified. I mean, I grew up in Wheaton, Illinois, evangelical center of the world, and I didn't know anybody who thought the earth was 6,000 years old. That was just bonkers. I've grown up thinking that was bonkers. I didn't think that was a part of evangelicalism. But when I read Ken Ham and then I realized how influential he had become, that really scared me. And I started seeing a number of my students, who had grown up in that, kind of go off, and we're going to talk about this, go off to college and then renounce their faith because of that whole thing. And so as I was researching all that's what was the inspiration for the writing of Heresy of Ham.
Okay, so it was before we get to the Heresy of Ham, is it correct to say you were forced out or asked to leave 2 Christian schools?
Yes.
Not 3, not the first one. The first one you left on your own, but numbers 2 and 3 you were asked to leave.
Yeah.
Did that create any sense of bitterness? Did it affect your faith at all? Did you have a faith crisis going from at least what I guess we'd call old earth creation to evolutionary creation or theistic evolution?
I would say, there was definitely a lot of hurt. No one likes, to get stabbed in the back, because in both situations, the headmaster principal, they did some pretty nasty stabbing in the back things as well that are beyond this conversation. So it wasn't just getting fired, but it was really being betrayed on a certain level. And that really hurt. But at that first school that in Arkansas, again, partly because I was still I'm pretty naive. When I was forced out there, I didn't have the crisis of, oh my gosh, Christianity is a big fraud. My mentality was, these 2 guys are jerks. Those guys hurt me, not Christianity. Sometimes you find jerks in the faith. The second time it happened, it really hurt because that, for all practical purpose, that ended my career teaching high school. But again, it was this one person, maybe two people that really were behind it. And by that time, I was, in my 40s. I'd done my biblical studies. I was pretty well grounded in my faith. So I wasn't tempted to chuck my faith, but it did hurt quite a bit. Does that answer the question better? Yeah, it wasn't a crisis of faith, but it really was very hurtful. But even then, I didn't take it and then lambast all of evangelical Christianity.
Yeah. You've been through a lot, and I guess you handled it better than most, because some people do harbor almost like PTSD from experiences like that, where you grow distrustful of the community. Even because you've been through, because you don't expect Christian people to act that way.
No, not at all. And it was very hurtful. But I'll add this, and here's another kind of ironic twist, is in my personal, faith journey, even though I grew up in Assemblies of God church, I didn't stay Assemblies of God. I became more and more attracted over the years to liturgy. And in 2006, when I was in Arkansas, I joined the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church. But I kept teaching in evangelical schools. So for me, I didn't consider myself an evangelical, but it wasn't because I hated it. My personality was drawn to orthodoxy, but I still thought evangelicals are Christians and we can work together. And so when the thing happened in Arkansas and then Alabama, it hurt, but I was already in my personal journey. I was already not an evangelical anyway. So did that make sense? So I wasn't tempted to. I never thought evangelicalism was a big fraud. I had just grown into orthodoxy, and so it was disappointing that these evangelical schools forced me out over this issue. But again, I still know most of people I know are evangelical Christians. They're good people. I'm not going to throw them under the bus because of what one or two jerks did. So you start investigating Ken Ham, and you're horrified, and not only for what he's teaching, but for the breadth of his influence. Yes.
And then what happens?
And how about his attitude and character too? Like you mentioned the jerks. Ken Ham modeled that. Yeah,
let me help you there, Christine. Yeah. I was a young Earth creationist early on. And when this is a true story, even when I was a young Earth creationist, and I could say the word despise now because I'm no longer a pastor, I despised Ken Ham. And it wasn't because we believed different things. We believed the same things. It was the way he presented himself and how rude and callous he was to others. And I thought, I don't want this guy being a spokesperson for what I believe. So I tended to lean toward the ICR side, the Institute for Creation Research, because they had a better demeanor, what I thought was a more Christian demeanor. So even when I was young Earth, I didn't like Ken Ham because I thought he was a horrible spokesperson. Now, if you ask me, I almost think he paved the way in evangelicalism for so many evangelicals to be admirers of Donald Trump and Donald Trump's behavior, to dismiss that because they've already seen it with Ken Ham.
Well,
but that's another subject.
Yeah. Well, and it is related. It is related to all this. And I think I mentioned at the end of my book, I mentioned that, and in my other book, my worldview book, I'll mention that as well. I kind of see the politicization of evangelicalism, but not just that one, but of a lot of other Christian groups that become more political, and that's, I think, adding to the division. But what I was going to say is, when I first came to this school in Alabama, the high school in Alabama, I had never heard of Ken Ham before, and one of my students early on kind of mentioned, "Hey, there's guy named Ken Ham, and let me watch this video, Mr. Anderson. This is really good about Genesis. And I remember I had never heard of Ken Ham before, and I watched this video, and I thought this guy was bonkers, and he was really rude. but at the time, I didn't realize how prevalent and how influential he was. And in the course of my reading up on answers in Genesis and young Earth creationism, and specifically Ken Ham, is I came to realize that even though they talk about science and that interpreting Genesis 1 through 11 is historical, that those two things really aren't at the heart, in my opinion, of young Earth creationism. The reason why young Earth creationism wants to prove the Earth is 6,000 years old is therefore it can prove that Genesis 1 through 11 is historical, and therefore we can win the culture war. And that's where you get off into political stuff. And I came to realize that that's the driving force, in my opinion, of a lot of young Earth creationist thinking. It's a highly political movement. They won't say it that way, but I can guarantee you, if you're ever in a chat group, a creation evolution chat group, and a young Earth creationist finds out that you don't think the Earth is 6,000 years old, I can guarantee you within 10 minutes they're going to say, so what's your view on gay marriage? What's your view of abortion? They immediately go to the political stuff. And the funny thing is politically, I'm still rather conservative. And so when they call me left-wing liberal, secular, atheist, I laugh because I have some really left-wing friends who call me right-wing Christian, And so, but for some reason, the creation evolution debate has gotten wrapped up into a larger cultural political debate, and that's really dangerous in my opinion.
Well, is part of it because they've equated evolution with atheism, therefore it's cultural Marxism?
Yeah, exactly. And then, and so that's what those on the right do. And then what happens with, and this is one of the things we're going to talk about, students who grow up in that, if they've grown up going through high school, being taught young Earth creationism with that mindset, when they go off to college and take a basic biology course and they realize, oh, there's actually evidence for evolution, what a lot of them do, unfortunately, is then they think, oh, therefore, all of Christianity I must chuck all that because I was told as a kid by my young Earth creationist teacher or pastor that if you accept evolution, you have to reject Christianity. Oh, I guess I have to reject Christianity. And then they go to the opposite end of the political spectrum just because they have to differentiate themselves from what they were before. And they themselves kind of get wrapped up in certain political views just to differentiate themselves from, ultra fundamentalists, what I would call them. And that's the danger. That's the sad thing. So, and I've seen it with a lot of students and with a lot of what, people who call themselves ex-evangelicals, who are just really bitter with that kind of ultra fundamentalist thinking. But the irony is that they've become just the same kind of intolerant mentality, just on the different political spectrum.
A fundamentalist on the other end of the continuum.
Yeah, exactly. I have a couple of people who sometimes barrage my blog, who former evangelicals who are now atheists, but they still have that proselytizing mentality. Now they're out on a crusade for atheism, the exact same mentality as Ken Ham, just on opposite sides. So.
Well, and the exact same way of reading scripture too, right? I mean, that same literalistic reading. It's just now they conclude that it's false because you've reviewed a couple books with authors who have done a similar flip on your blog.
I saw early on, like when I did a bunch of book reviews on Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion and Sam Harris's The End of Faith and Christopher Hitchens' God Is Not Great and the Dan Barker book. And what when I was studying Ken Ham and then the Dawkins stuff, what I realized, and I say it this way, that Richard Dawkins and Ken Ham really are just each other's doppelganger. They read scripture in the exact same wooden literalistic way. They both have this mentality that if you believe evolution, then Christianity is false. They have the same views. Just, they have a different take on evolution, but they still have that same mentality. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit more about your blog. What else do you cover on your blog?
Well, I originally started a blog when I was still teaching at this high school, and that original one was called Resurrected Orthodoxy, because after the experience that I had in Arkansas, and then I got this chance in Alabama, and initially for the first 7 years, I had a lot of support. I was really optimistic that I'll be able to kind of do this biblical studies, biblical worldview curriculum for high school. And if Christians are just honest debate and respectful debate, this is what it could be. We could bring back traditional Orthodox Christianity, not necessarily orthodoxy into an evangelical school, but, really be the kind of Christianity that you always hope for. And so it's the resurrected Orthodoxy was kind of hopeful, like we've done it. Yeah, this is it. And then after I got shellacked a second time, I closed that blog. It was didn't have a blog for a short time, and then I started a new one. So I kind of renamed it Resurrecting Orthodoxy because it's still a process. But anyway, on the blog, I kind of use it as my outlet for kind of thinking. The way I think is I write, and so on the blog, I'll do various book reviews of books I think that are interesting, and I don't just do like a general, this is a good book, one post thing. If I read a book that I really like, I'll do kind of a book series, and I'll go through chapter by chapter. I'll kind of interact with the book and tell here are the good points. Here's what I think, and kind of use it as an opportunity to really get into it. So I'll do book reviews. Early on, I did a lot of posts on Ken Ham and young Earth creationism. I wrote a lot early on that. I've written a lot on atheism as well. I did a whole series that is now my second book, Christianity and the Revolution and Worldviews. This really was originally, this is a fun story. When I was teaching biblical worldview at this most recent high school, I was trying to develop curriculum. We'll get back to the blog. This will go back to the blog, trust me. When I was developing a high school curriculum, I thought freshman year we'll do Old Testament, sophomore year we'll go through the New Testament, junior year we'll do like Christian history, and we read Mere Christianity. That was junior year. And then senior year we would do worldview, like Western culture, philosophy. And initially, because that wasn't my area of expertise, I patterned it after Francis Schaeffer's How Should We Then Live book, because I read that in college and I thought it was pretty good, kind of laid out history in that way. So I used that book to start out with, but then the more I did my own reading, over time, the more I found myself saying, well, Francis Schaeffer says this, but here's something better. And after a few years, I thought, hey, maybe I should write my own Western, worldview book. So I was putting that together, and then I got not rehired. And so I had all this material, and so I let it sit on my computer for a while. And then a few years later, I decided to put it into kind of a series on my blog, little by little, where I went through Western culture. And then once I did that, I thought maybe I can get that published as well. And so that book kind of summarizes the kind of things I was trying to teach my seniors in high school. So I covered that on my blog for a while. I sometimes do political, cultural issues. I keep those at a minimum because it's such a toxic thing to do, and I don't want to do it that much, but it is important to touch upon. And obviously, I do a lot of posts on biblical studies issues. I did a series for a while on the New Testament's use of the Old Testament, how you understand that dynamic, So I've done a lot of biblical study stuff on my blog from time to time. Recently, though, I haven't written that much on it just because I'm teaching a full load this semester, and I have an idea for another book of mine that I'm kind of taking up my time. So,
Joel, I want to go back for a second to your experience at the Christian schools and teaching there, and how some of the students would come up to you and say, "Thank you. This is liberating for me," and I understand for the first time. How are they to react when they see a favorite teacher of theirs who's teaching them to think critically? How are they to react to see that the machine grinds that person or kicks them to the curb? You mentioned that you've also witnessed students walk away from the faith because of either the resentment, and I think it's a mixture. I think it's a cocktail of resentment and shame when somebody goes through believing they were duped, believing that they answered that email from Nigeria about the long-lost uncle who's going to leave us $1 billion. And there's a shame in that. And maybe that does take us to the other extreme of the continuum, because we that's how we find kind of a restitution, if you will. But talk to me a little bit about that, about how much the church still needs to grow in this area. And was that the inspiration for you writing your book, The Heresy of Ham?
Well, the inspiration for me writing the book was really my attempt to make sense of what had happened to me, because at the time, I just did not understand why I was essentially getting fired over this. It just made no sense to me. And so the book was first and foremost kind of my own therapy to wrestle with what had happened. And because I didn't want it to stay inside and just eat away at me, I wanted to understand it. And once you understand something, oh, this is why they acted this way, just understanding what had happened, you can then put it to the side and move on with your life. It's the not understanding and just letting the hate and hurt fester. That's the thing that kills you. And so that's why I wrote the book. But yeah, I think when students either go off to college and find out what they've been told is wrong, that's devastating. And I think a lot of students, because not to toot my own horn, but I was the favorite teacher of most students because of my glowing personality. So when that happened to me, I think a lot of students and a lot of parents were really upset too, because it was kind of done in a, underhanded fashion. So once they found out that I wasn't coming back, it was too late to do anything. And I think a lot of people were really hurt. But because of that, I knew I couldn't react. I couldn't lash out because it would affect them, I mean, obviously, there's a little bit of lashing out. Like when I started this blog, if you go back to my blog, I think I started it in July of 2015. I finished teaching there in May of 2015, but I knew I wasn't coming back for that whole year. So I kept quiet for a whole year, just researching it. And then in August, when I decided I'm going to start writing about Ken Ham, I did write this post called "Why I Am Not Teaching This Year" in the Heresy of Ham. And I didn't name names, but I basically said, I've always wanted to teach high school. I thought that was my calling. And a couple people who shall be remain nameless, kind of torpedoed me. And I kind of went off onto the big problem with it. And that got, again, at that point, I had like a handful of followers. I had just started the blog. And I wrote it, and it must have gotten passed around a lot, because I think within a couple of days, it was like, I don't know what the hits were, but I want to say it was in the thousands. And so it, how you react to it does affect others. So you want to speak truthfully about it, but you don't want to sound hateful and bitter, but you need to share your disappointment. And so you have to balance that because people who like you, especially students, you need to model for them the right way to deal with inevitable disappointment in your life. Because at some point, as sad as it sounds, there is going to be someone in a Christian setting or a church in your life who's going to stab you in the back. It's going to happen at some point. You're going to be disappointed with other people who call themselves Christians. And so you better know how to deal with it. So, but yeah, I think a number of students probably took it hard, and some of them a few years later when they got off to college, they kind of hate Christianity now, and I'm sure that had something to do with it. It probably wasn't the only thing, but it probably contributed. So, yeah.
So heresy is kind of a heavy charge. How do you define heresy? How do you use it in your book? And you're not saying that just holding to a young Earth creation view in and of itself is heresy, correct? So unpack that a little bit.
Yeah. Right. I make that really. I think I make that really clear at the beginning of the book. Is that I'm not saying if you believe the Earth is young that you're a heretic. And first of all, you have to have the proper understanding of heresy. Too many times that's thrown around by people to say, if you don't believe what I believe, you're not a Christian, that kind of thing. I try to explain it in the early part of the book. You have to understand in the context of Christian history, heresy is basically teaching that deviates from the accepted, what I call creedal fundamentals of the faith, as in the creeds, the block solid basics of the faith that virtually every denomination and branch agree on. If you teach that Jesus was just a man and not divine, well, that's heresy, because the church has always taught that he was both divine and human. Okay, so heresy is teaching something that either directly contradicts those fundamentals of the faith, or, and this is where I think you can tie in the younger creationism for some people, of if you elevate a secondary non-essential issue that Christians disagree on, and have always disagreed on, but they're still Christians, if you elevate that issue to the same level as a creedal fundamental of the faith, and then start judging other people on that secondary issue, I think you are dabbling your toes in the heretical waters, And so, for example, and I've had this thrown at me a couple times of, if you don't believe the earth is 6,000 years old, then you're not a Christian, because then you just throw away the resurrection of Christ, And I want to say, how do you make that connection? At no time in church history has anybody made belief in a young earth a fundamental tenet of the faith. And if you do make it into a fundamental tenet of the faith, that's not a good thing to do. And so to put that all together, believing the earth is young, or if you don't believe in evolution, that's fine. You're still a Christian. I think you're wrong on those issues, but I'm not going to judge you as not being a Christian for that. But if you start saying, if you accept evolution, then you're not a Christian, then I'm going to tell you that you're doing something that has never been done in church history before. You're elevating a secondary issue to a primary issue, and that should not be done. So that's how I understand heresy, and that's what I try to get across in the book. The problem with a lot of young earth creationists like Ken Ham isn't that they believe the earth is young, or they interpret Genesis 1 through 11 in a different way than I do. Christians disagree on things. But it's their elevation of that issue as if it was the core fundamental of the faith. That's the problem. Because that's the foundation of the gospel is the resurrection of Christ. It's not whether or not you think the earth is 6,000 years.
I love the title of your book when I first read it, because I thought you were kind of tweaking that side anyway, because they love to play the heretic card with people like you who they would say compromise the authority of the Word of God. So they would agree with you that they're not about young earth creation. They're ultimately about the authority of the Word of God, and the way you handle it is compromising.
And I'm trying to get back in the camera frame. I moved and I started getting off center. There we go. Okay.
I know at my church, my kids have been told that we're not really Christians because we don't hold the young earth creation view.
See, and that I would say is a heretical view, because that's not the core tenet of the view. Yeah. And plus, the other reason I named it Heresy of Ham, to be quite honest, like being a literature major, I really like the alliteration. It's a catchy title. It doesn't. Nothing else would really work, you know. So, but yeah, I think it's an issue that needs to be addressed, but it's important to realize. I'm not saying if you happen to believe the Earth is young that you're a heretic. It's like, I don't care if you do or not. Personally, if you make that into a core issue, then I have a problem with that. So yeah.
Do you think post-Enlightenment thinking is contributing to this approach to Scripture and part of the discussion involved?
Well, I think definitely. I mean, whether it's Enlightenment thinking or post-Enlightenment thinking, I do think American Christianity, especially evangelicalism, is, I don't want to say enslaved to, but it is heavily influenced by Enlightenment and thinking and the consequences of all that. I mean, the very, very idea, I mean, a lot of young earth creationism, for example, they claim that, God created everything perfect right from the beginning, and then after sin, things wound down and, fell out of whack. Well, when you think about it, that's kind of a deistic view, that everything was perfect, and then things wound down because God was out somewhere else. So I think a lot of, American culture in general, whether it's Christian or not, I mean, we're children of the Enlightenment, and we often read into Scripture and read into our Christian views. We just unthinkingly put a lot of Enlightenment assumptions in that we don't even realize we're doing, and that's a problem. A good example would be, the talk of miracles. In the Greek New Testament, in the New Testament, if you read in your English Bibles, you'll see, occasionally Jesus did miracles. Well, the actual word is dunamis, which would be better translated as dynamic deeds, because we say miracles in the modern world because we have this idea of this clear split between the natural world over here and the supernatural world over here. And we have this assumption that God created the world, and that occasionally miracles are when he monkeys with the machine for a little bit to do something special, like a temporary lifting of the natural laws. Well, in the ancient world, they didn't have that view that God was ever not involved with his creation. So therefore, I don't think miracle is a right word. It's dynamic. God is always at work in his creation, but sometimes he does things that we don't understand, dynamic deeds. Jesus heals people. We don't get how that happened, but we shouldn't think of it like he's violating a natural law, because they have no concept of that modern scientific category of natural law. Does that make sense? So the very way we in America on this side of the Enlightenment even assume certain things, I think is problematic. So
one of the chapters in your book is on biblical exegesis. So what are some of the basics that you talk about, and how would you approach maybe teaching a Sunday school class for high schoolers to impart this wisdom on students so that they can go from a little kid, very concrete Bible story understanding of Scripture to a more mature, in-depth, nuanced understanding?
Well, when it comes to biblical exegesis itself, scholars have written books on the various steps. If you've ever had to write an exegesis paper, there's a whole bunch of stuff. When it gets right down to it, biblical exegesis is just trying to get at the original meaning of the text, understanding what it meant in the original context. And when you think about that, that's what you do with anything you read. anything you read, you're trying to understand what the author was conveying. And so when you read the Bible and, biblical exegesis you're trying to do that with ancient scripture that is, thousands of years separated from your time in a completely different culture. And really all it means, instead of giving you a step-by-step what you can do, it really boils down to two things, in my opinion. Doing a little research to understand the historical context of any given passage. Like right now, I'm teaching an Old Testament introduction class. And one of the things I really emphasize to my students, because most people, when they think of the Old Testament, they think they know it, but they really don't. They have a handful of Sunday school stories, but you ask them, hey, what's the difference between Isaiah and Malachi? They couldn't tell you. They would think they're all back there, But that would be kind of like the equivalent of saying, and this is a good modern example. Let's say if I gave you the Gettysburg Address, but you had no concept of American history. You could read the Gettysburg Address and probably, this is about a war and dead people happen, But you couldn't, if you don't know the historical background, you don't know the significance of the Gettysburg Address. And if you really didn't know your American history, you might think, Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, they're all kind of same time period, right? Just by putting it that way, you realize how important understanding the historical context is. You have to know the historical context in order to understand what you're reading. So if you're going to read Isaiah, the first half of Isaiah, you have to know when it was set and what events were happening in Israel at the time so you could interpret it correctly. So the first thing when it comes to biblical exegesis really just requires you to do a little bit of historical study and background to understand the background of whatever passage book you're reading. The second basic point would be learn to become a good reader. And again, this is one of the biggest problems I would say young earth creationists have with Genesis 1 through 11. They assume Genesis 1 through 11 must be historical narrative, and they try to interpret it that way without ever considering that in the ancient world, they didn't write histories to talk about their gods. They used the genre of myth to express their belief in the gods. And because of that, because they viewed, they didn't have a sense of history. It was just the gods and the kings and the little peons just going around in a cyclical motion throughout history without history. They don't even think of history. They had no sense of history. In the ancient world, they didn't have a sense of history. They just had myths about the gods, the annals of the kings, and all the people were just miserable slaves. We don't care about them. Therefore, there was no reason to write history. It was just mythological cycles. But in Genesis 1 through 11, those early chapters, I think, are in the genre of myth to express their belief about who God is and the worth of human beings, created in God's image. And once that's established, the fact that human beings are created in God's image, that is the basis for writing history. And that's what you get, I would argue, starting with Abraham, then they tell the history of Israel. But you have to have that basis for why you do history in the first place.
So here's where I have a little fun and I get to push back. So I'm going to put on my skeptic's hat now and say, isn't that a terribly inefficient way for an omnipotent, omniscient God to communicate? But first of all, before we go there, let me defend the young earth creationist a little bit because I'm the contrarian and say, isn't the old earth creationist just as wrong or not more wrong on the text, Joel? Because he argues that a day is not a day. And a day is clearly a day in a myth, right? If we're talking about a day in Lord of the Rings, it's not 1,000 years or a million years. It's a day and the order of creation. So can we say that Ken Ham gets it all right, except the fact that he takes it literally? Compared to the old earth creationist. And at some point, I want to come back to the Ben Stein thing and your realization that it's more about It's not just the Heresy of Ham. There's some deception of Discovery Institute going on too.
Yeah.
And is that going to be a follow-up book to the Heresy of Ham for you? But so let me ask you this. You studied ancient Near Eastern mythology. You basically implied or admitted that virtually no one in your circle of Christian influence growing up made that connection. None of them knew that. You had to go to seminary to learn about that. John Walton writes a book. It's hugely controversial because the vast majority of Christians think that's crazy, that, or somehow that's cheapening of inerrancy. So let me get to this. If Genesis is the ancient Jews saying, you know what? We'll see your pagan gods and we'll raise you. It's not a Numel-ish. It's this.
Yeah.
And then if Exodus is the writers saying, we'll see your Egyptian pantheon and we'll raise you. And then we get to the New Testament and Paul on Mars Hill says, we'll see your Greek gods and we'll raise you. How is the Bible the word of God and not just the word of really creative Jewish storytellers saying that my God is bigger than your God?
Okay. There's a lot to unpack there. What was I going to... First thing, let me back up first about the day is the day is comment you made. Yes, in Genesis 1, a day is a day. And this is one of the problems I have with old earth creationists and even a lot of theistic evolutionists as well, who try to read science stuff into those early chapters of Genesis, concordism. I have a problem with concordism as a whole. So when a young earth creationist says, show me in Genesis 1 where there's millions of years, and I'll say, there is no millions of years in Genesis 1. It's not talking about that scientific question of how old the earth is to begin with. It's not addressing that issue. And I think the problem with whether it's young earth creationists or old earth creationists like Hugh Ross, for example, as nice a guy as he is, I just think the assumption that they start with that, these chapters must be addressing modern scientific questions that we have in the 21st century America, it must be answering that because those are the questions we have. I think that's really problematic. And this gets back to the basic understanding of biblical exegesis is the first thing you have to do is to ask, what were these chapters saying to the original audience of Israelites living in the ancient Near East? Because that's the inspired message. And that's where you start with, in the ancient world, they used mythology to express their beliefs about the gods. So how is God, Yahweh, going to reveal who he is to these Israelites who've grown up in the ancient Near East surrounded by this mythological stuff? He's going to speak to them in a language, in a way they would be able to relate to. It wouldn't make sense for him to start giving scientific historical claims and facts to them because they're not asking those questions to begin with. And when you realize that, when you try to read Genesis 1 from that perspective of the ancient Near East, you realize, and this is kind of humorous, but I've always put it this way, if you're an ancient Israelite and you hear or read Genesis 1 for the first time, you are not going to be thinking, wow, this really refutes Darwinism. Take that, atheism. You're not going to be thinking that because that's not your worldview. You're not even in that time. Instead, what you're going to be realizing when you're confronted with Genesis 1, the first thing you're going to say is there's one God and there's not a lot of them, because that's the revolution in worldview that's going on in Genesis 1. And then you read a little further. The created order is good and orderly. That's not what these other myths say. And then when it comes to human beings, that human beings are created in that one good God's image, those three things take a torpedo to the entire old pagan worldview. But it's using mythological language to address it because that's the language they understand. And so with that, I think that's why it's important to understand that original context, because that's the inspired meaning that is so revolutionary, and that is what lays the basis for the telling of history. And so, moving on from the other things you said, a lot of it is genre recognition as well. Genesis 1 through 11, and we have to be clear, Genesis 1 through 11 is different than Genesis 12 to 50. It's written differently. In Genesis 1 through 11, you can go through hundreds of years in a verse. As soon as you get to Genesis 12 with Abraham, you have one lifetime taking up 13 chapters. Time slows down a lot in the storytelling once you get to Abraham. And therefore, you have to understand the genre to interpret it correctly. And Genesis 1 through 11 is a certain kind of genre. And when you get to Abraham and beyond, it's not the same kind of genre. Yeah, I think I lost my thought, but I think I kind of answered what you said. It gets down to historical context of what the original meaning was and understanding genre recognition. Now, Again, even by saying, is it historical or is it theological or is it just literary? Like the patriarch story, I think, and this is one of the things you kind of gave to me ahead of time, I think there was a historical Abraham. I think these are historical people. But the stories are still written as stories. And so you have to be a good historian, but be a good reader of literature at the same time. And I think the example I always give is to understand how to read these ancient stories is similar to, like, let's say you go to the movie and you see Hacksaw Ridge that Mel Gibson made a couple years ago. Okay, everybody knows that Hacksaw Ridge is about historical events, World War II. Yes, the characters in Hacksaw Ridge were real people. But at the same time, when Gibson made the movie, he invented dialogue. He changed some of the minor historical facts so it would fit better into the narrative he was giving. So for example, when we learned that Private Doss was a conscientious objector. In the movie, the reason for him being a conscientious objector, that's a hard word to say, conscientious objector, is that when he was younger, his dad got into a fight with his mom and pulled out a gun and he stopped him. In reality, it was his dad got in a fight with his uncle. In the actual history, it was his fight with his uncle. But Gibson said, I'm just going to make the fight with his mom to fit better into the story because I have a limited time to tell it. And that's okay. We understand that. We understand that movie directors use a little bit of creative license in the telling of history. We do that all the time. And therefore, I think the same goes for a lot of what we find in the historical narratives in the Bible. It's history, but we still have to appreciate the artistic storytelling aspect to it as well.
Joel, when we hear you talk about what Genesis means theologically, or when we hear John Walton or Greg Davidson, it is a beautiful story. It's beautiful. Yeah. Does it trouble you that 98% of the conversation about Genesis isn't about what you talk about? It's not about the theology. It's about old Earth arguing calendar with young Earth, or, it's about the science conversation.
Yeah, that is very troubling. And that is when I first studied the Genesis 1 through 11 on my own right after Regent College, and being a literature major when I got into it, that's when it became so interesting. And when I taught it to students, that's when they really started getting interested in it. And I think a lot of times with Genesis 1 through 11, the science discussion dominates because, like what you talked about earlier, we are still children of the Enlightenment, and we bring our Enlightenment assumptions to the text. We assume, he must be talking about science here, when he isn't. And therefore, we have all these arguments over concordism and young Earth creationism, is day as a day, and people just yell at each other over that. And when you do that, you completely miss the point of the original context. You're doing eisegesis and not exegesis, really. So yeah, it is very troubling, because I think going through the story from the original context, that's what's interesting. That's where you really get into the story of what it means. And when you try to impose scientific discussions on those early chapters, it gets very dry and it gets very, well, kind of boring sometimes, A day means yom. That's a day. Okay, yeah, that does mean a day. But you're missing the point. So, and again, I think me being a literature major, that's what really irritates me, because you're missing the point of the original context.
Yeah. Well, and talk a little bit too about the harm to Christianity or to students when they're taught that part of defending Christianity is to approach these texts in that way, or to part of defending Christianity is to refute the science in order to support this authority of Scripture. What's the harm in that? What have you seen?
Well, I mean, first of all, the harm is you're doing bad science. It's pseudoscience. What Ken Ham does is really bad. That the movie that came out a couple of years ago is Genesis history. Those attempts to cram young Earth creationist science into a 6,000 year time period, it just ends up being very ridiculous. And it's, so that hurts. And so if you're a student and you've grown up with that, and then, like we said earlier, go off to college and learn what science actually does, then you tend to chuck the whole thing. So that's, on that one hand, that's really hurtful. But more importantly, if I can say that, is we're not teaching students, we're not teaching not just students, we're not teaching Christians how to intelligently read the Bible. So a good example, this is actual happening, take the story of Jonah. How many times have you heard people talk about Jonah, and it always delves into human beings really could survive in a big fish for 3 days. Like, they make that scientific, they start going that realm, and they fail to realize what's the point of Jonah? What's it saying? When was it written? What was the original context? It was, as far as that's concerned, I wrote my master's thesis on Jonah, and I'm convinced that the story of Jonah is a parable. It's a parable, a post-exilic parable, and the exiles were remnants of the southern kingdom of Judah. So it was a post-exilic southern parable, but the Jonah was a pre-exilic northern prophet. And so you have to consider that dynamic to understand what is going on in the story and who it was written to. And I had mentioned that at one point when I was teaching this at this high school, that I personally thought that the book of Jonah was more parable-like. And I had a parent come in who was a pastor, and he basically came in and told me that when you told my son that Jonah was a parable, you were telling him that I'm a liar. And I was like, no, I'm pretty sure I didn't say that. But because this pastor was missing the whole point of Jonah and just reading it as, proof that, people can survive in big fish, he took offense at that, and he became pretty divisive. So getting back to what you were saying is that approach of using the Bible to defend true science against godless science, it brings about some very bad science, but it keeps people biblically illiterate. And they're afraid to read the Bible for what it is, because they think they have to defend the Bible instead of read it and let it change their lives. And I think one of my favorite writers, Thomas Merton, the Catholic monk, I can't remember the exact quote, but he basically said, the Christian shouldn't be concerned with defending the truth, is just making sure it is seen clearly. The truth can handle itself, And I think this rush we feel like we need to defend the Bible, I think it's misguided. You explain it, what it originally means, and you're okay with it. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's especially troubling if you're trying to defend Christianity with bad science or a false narrative. The truth doesn't need falsehoods to support it. Speaking of
Christine, you might as well. Yeah. I don't. This might not have even been in the script, but since Joel brought it up, you've been to a number of Christian apologetics conferences where they attack as part of their method evolutionary creation. Do you want to talk about that? And maybe we'll steer towards intelligent design and other things.
Sure, yeah. So I have. I've been to some speakers that are well-known apologists, and part of their spiel for teaching students to defend Christianity has been inoculating them against evolution, or we don't believe in evolution, and instead God designed, and here's some fine-tuning or some kind of spiel about defending God and rejecting evolution, and the dichotomy that they present is very troubling to me. And I'm sure you have seen it too. And most of the ones that I have attended have had an ID flavor, like a Discovery Institute type of intelligent design flavor to them. And I just really think this is going to be difficult for students who've grown up that part of defending the truth of Christianity requires rejection of the most fundamental theory underlying all of biology.
Yeah. Well, I think, in a way, though, I think a lot of the intelligent design movement. Now, again, this kind of gets back to the Ben Stein movie. I think at least some of that is at least acknowledging, it's not as bad as young Earth creationism. Let's put it that way. At least they a lot of intelligent design guys, they acknowledge, that the Earth is much older and things have. They wouldn't use the word evolved, but that. But when I again, watching the Ben Stein movie is the thing that kind of got me into the whole issue through the intelligent design take on it. And one of the things that was kind of a light bulb for me is I got into a discussion with a guy who was just saying intelligent design isn't scientific and blah, 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 blah. And at that point, I didn't know much about it. I was just kind of throwing out questions. And what occurred to me after he was telling me some stuff about it is the basic argument of intelligent design, namely, look at the complexity in the created order. This proves there is an intelligent designer. On a certain level, yeah, I think that's true. I think when you look at the natural world and all the complexity, I do think it does point to you can call an intelligent design, or you can call God. But that argument, even though I think that's true, it's not a scientific argument. You can't prove it through scientific means. It's more of a philosophical argument. And so the problem within the intelligent design movement, in my opinion, isn't that they're wrong, that the complexities in the natural order imply that there is a creator. I think it does imply it, but their attempt to make it into a pseudo-scientific argument, which it isn't. The example I have given in the past over this is, again, it gets down to what is the function of science. Science basically describes the workings of nature. That's its job. That's all it can do. It can describe how nature works. It can't say anything beyond that. And the example I would give is, let's say you come across a bike, but it's not put together, just bike parts and a sheet of directions. And that's all you have. All the directions can tell you is to how to put the bike together. The directions can't say anything about the bike, the Schwinn company, who owns Schwinn, or where the warehouse is. It can't answer any of the stuff of where the parts came from. All it can do is describe how the parts work together. And I think science in my lay understanding, science is good at that. Science explains how the nature parts work, but it can't say anything if there's anything beyond that. It's limited to the directions. And therefore, the intelligent design movement that tries to say, because of the directions, there must be a Schwinn bike company. Yeah, there probably is, but the directions can't get you there. And I think, therefore, their attempt to make science prove the existence of God is misleading and wrong to start to try to do. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah.
No.
I like the
no, it doesn't make sense. It was generous, and here's why. So here's my pushback. If that's all the intelligent design movement did, I'd agree with you. But they go beyond that. They go to Darwin's evil, and they attack evolution, as cultural Marxism. And then the Ben Stein movie. The other thing we need to point out is they conflate evolution with cosmology, and they often do this. They say evolution has no answer for the beginning of the universe, and you have to say, well, you mean biological evolution doesn't have an answer for Big Bang? So they conflate, and they know better. Joel, these guys are educated guys. They know better. So in a sense, I'm calling them, I think, what did you say? Dichotomous? What did you say, Christine? I'd say it's duplicitous in a way to suggest that evolution has a comment on the origin of the universe and not just the origin of species. So, and then to bring in the cultural stuff if you see Discovery Institute's just article after article, where I think what you brought up earlier, Joel, about the politicization of the whole thing, I think they are fighting a cultural war too. They're just more subtle. And the only, and then I'm going to let you respond, but the only other thing I'd say is I actually think it just may be more dangerous than young Earth creation, in that young Earth creation really is the clown nose and the big feet. Right? Yeah. And ID is kind of, a three-piece suit. It kind of gives Christians a place to park where they feel scientific and they feel like, and I think that might be harder to wean yourself out of than young Earth creation. I think one semester in biology or even New Testament studies in university can wean you of Ken Ham, but I'm not sure it could do the same with Discovery Institute. But your chance to respond. You or Christine can respond. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I would say my point was just on that singular point that the complexity of nature points to a creator. That I was focusing on that. Yeah, and again, I haven't done a lot of reading on this Discovery Institute, but I know enough where they kind of get off into the cultural wars thing. And that's problematic. I was just focusing on that singular point that complexity of nature points to God. I think it does, but that's not a scientific question to begin with. It's a philosophical one. Yeah, but they do a whole bunch of other stuff, kind of like Ken Ham, which is bad. I agree with you there. I was just making a point on that one specific point. So yeah. Did you ever see the movie? I think it was on Nova. It was a documentary on the Dover court case. I forgot what it was called.
I'm adding it to my list as you mentioned this. I'd love to see that. Yeah.
What's the name of it? You know what it is? Actually, Nova. This is how naive I was when I taught in high school this stuff. In my Darwin unit, when that came out, I showed it to my students at a Christian school. But it was a fascinating documentary, and it does show
Intelligent Design on Trial. Is that?
Yes.
Yeah, Judgment Day, Intelligent Design on Trial. Yeah.
Yes. I remember watching that, and it goes into at whatever the intelligent design textbook that a certain couple parents were trying to get into the system. Oh, it's intelligent design. It's scientific.
Pandas and people, something like that.
Yes. Yeah, they had actual early manuscript evidence that when it was in production, it was originally a young Earth creationist book, and then some court case came down, and so they just changed, I think, young Earth creationism, whatever it was in, and just put intelligent design. It was the exact same book. So yeah, that was completely deceptive, but it's a fascinating documentary. So yeah.
And I know we often focus on young Earth creation because as you said, when you first found out about Ken Ham, the absurdity just knocked you out of your chair. So yeah. I know we focus a lot on that. I actually think the issue though of creation science might be a better place to focus, because that's the tree that has old Earth, young Earth, and ID in it. And the one thing they share is they're usually concordist. Some ID aren't, but they're concordist, and they're very anti-evolutionary. I almost think there's going to be a really long line of Christians in heaven waiting to apologize to Darwin.
Yeah, I don't know. I think for me, when I started learning about evolution, for me, I never had that hang up. Oh my gosh, this is anti-Christian, because like I said, I already knew that Genesis 1 through 11 wasn't talking about that issue. And so when I started looking into what evolution said, and I'm like, oh, that's possible. Okay. Again, I don't have a PhD in science. I'm not an expert in it, but from what I've read, I could say, okay, that sounds convincing. I don't feel like I need to defend anything. You just see the truth clearly. And I'm sure that, 100 years from now, based on when science discovers more things, I'm sure 100 years from now, people are going to look back to today on what specifically people believed about evolutionary questions. And I'm sure they're going to say, wow, they got a couple things wrong. That's okay. That's what science does. So I don't know. For me, it was never a point of doctrinal dogma as it is for a lot of these groups. You have to get the science right. That's Christian doctrine, and that conflation is the big problem.
Right.
So I've never understood the obsession over it. So,
I would love to hear your advice. What would you tell other Christian teachers at Christian schools, or youth pastors, or youth leaders? Even parents, when their kids are growing up and coming to start talking about these topics, what advice do you have that you would want to share that would be helpful in the adults' lives, in their dialogue with students, so that when these kids go off to college, they don't face a giant crisis of faith, that they can navigate through issues?
I think the fundamental thing is don't place an undue theological importance on questions like evolution. Don't elevate that to a tenet of the faith, and be willing to admit that, hey, I'm not sure. Honesty is the best thing. And so I think those two things alone are the biggest things. I think that's kind of what saved me in a way, is that my parents never made a big deal about it. I never thought it was a core tenet of the faith, because they never made it a core tenet of the faith. And then, they were open to ask questions about a lot of stuff. I mean, it was not just young Earth creationism stuff. I remember, whether it's end time speculation. My parents were like, well, we believe Christ is going to come back. We're not sure when, and we're not going to get tied up into all that needless speculation that nobody knows anyway. And so I kind of grew up they kind of instilled in me kind of a very level-headed, mature way to assess issues of secondary importance. Does that make sense? And so I think as a parent, as a Bible teacher, as a youth group leader, whatever it is, that's the most important thing, is to give them a balanced sense of what is truly core fundamentals of the faith and what isn't, and don't make the isn't into an is. When you do that, that's when you screw up a lot of people. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem too many people do that. They kind of get on their, got to defend Christianity high horse by doing science. And, I think that's kind of a big problem. And that leads to a lot of disunity and a lot of, Paul would say the works of the flesh, because when you see the works of the flesh, most of them are division, and you can always tell when something isn't right is when all it brings is division. That's probably a big red flag,
Yeah. So you mentioned a lot of times the core of Christianity. Summarize just first real quick. If someone is newer to investigating Christianity, what is Christianity? How do you become a Christian? What does it mean to follow Jesus? Just, a quickie little, if you aren't following Christ and you want to right now, what do you do?
Well, that was funny. That was one of your questions where I thought that's really hard to put into a nice succinct way. That's really hard because there is no formula necessarily. Growing up, it was like in my church, every Sunday they would have an altar call, come down, say this prayer, and bam, you're a Christian. It's not that simple. From the Orthodox Christian perspective, they say, it's not a question of when were you saved. It's you're constantly being saved. You're entering into a relationship with God and you're seeking the truth. And, as God reveals himself to you, as Christ reveals himself to you, you respond in faith little by little. Now, that's usually the personal faith journey that you have to go on. I think that you have to realize it's a journey. It's not something I do once and I'm done with it. It's kind of like mistaking the wedding ceremony for the whole life of marriage. The wedding ceremony is just the beginning. But for me, I've always, ever since I was in high school, C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, to this day, I think is the best, easiest to understand encapsulation of what constitutes Mere Christianity. And so, obviously, there are a number of doctrinal, theological beliefs that are core, but we can't mistake them. We can't treat Christianity as just like a bunch of things you got to check off you say you believe. What he gives is, theology is like a map. The map is good, but you have to travel. You have to go on the journey yourself. So I don't think you can give an easy answer. For me, I kind of viewed it as there's been a number of times in my life at various stages when I was kind of confronted with a choice, a life-changing choice. And you have to you have a number of little narrow gates, to use the biblical analogy, enter through the narrow gate. It's not just one. Throughout your life, there's a number of them you have to choose to go through and to keep going. I think for me that's the biggest thing to realize. But yeah, at the core of it is Jesus is Lord of creation, and you accept him because he's going to sanctify and renew creation, and you put your faith in him to become part of Christ's body, to be a part of that whole thing.
Revisiting the heretic card, when Hank Hanegraaff left evangelicalism to become an Eastern Orthodox, the gatekeepers of Christianity pounced with the heretic card, and some of the usual suspects, John MacArthur, others. When you see John MacArthur responding to the COVID crisis in this way, I want to ask you to see it through the eyes of the skeptic now. And those people who are looking at the Christian church from the outside, and they're seeing all the divisiveness that you mentioned, and they're seeing the division. And they're not seeing Jesus because there's too many Christians in the way. So what is your hope for the body of Christ when you see all this division and you know that it's a clear obstacle, maybe the biggest obstacle for people even considering Christ? Yeah,
I think, and I go back to I'll go back first. Let me go back to like when I was in high school in the 80s when Jim Bakker and Jimmy Swaggart, because I was in an Assemblies of God church, they were kind of big deals in some circles. And when they fell, there's a lot of Christian leaders, either they fall or they get very divisive and combative like MacArthur. It's easy to mistake to see those Christian leaders and therefore think all of Christians are like them. And from a skeptic, from the outside view, you're going to think that because they were the ones on TV. They're the ones on the billboards and stuff. And unfortunately, there's not much you can do when you get kind of divisive bad leaders. What does Paul say? The name of the Lord is blasphemed among the nations because of you. I think that accusation is fitting for a lot of Christian leaders. They're really bad witnesses, and it screws it up for the rest of us. And again, I think the disunity, and this is something, again, in our political climate, if we want to go there, that is really kind of sobering and troubling, that it's really coming apparent to me more than ever, is, to me, that disunity in the church is probably the worst thing. And if you've ever read any of the early church fathers, they make that very clear. They were always telling their churches that the worst thing you can do is to foster division among fellow believers. If you have to take a hit and be wronged, do it because you don't want to split the church. And unfortunately, what's the history of, Protestant church in general? That's what they do. They divide all the time. We're 20,000 different denominations because they have to divide because I'm right and you're wrong. That division is the worst thing. It's the worst witness you can have. It's not a witness. It's the anti-witness. And that's really, really disturbing to me. There's no good answer. The only thing I could say is I remember back Sting's third solo album, The Soul Cages. Sting is my favorite. That's a whole nother story. God has used Sting's albums in my Christian life in a way that I think is amazing. But he has a song called All This Time. And at the end of the song, he has this line that I've never forgotten. Men go crazy in congregations. They only get better one by one. And I think that's applicable not just to Christian congregations or churches. That's applicable to any group. That groupthink brings division, and they drive people crazy. And when it gets right down to it, even in the church, there's going to be problems. There's always problems. People get better one by one. It's who are the people in your individual life that you can build up. That's what you need to focus on. And fortunately for me, given some of the bad stuff that has happened to me, that I think probably would have driven a lot of people away from the faith, I had a number of close Christian friends and family members who that was my church more than anything. I'm Eastern Orthodox, yes. I don't get to go to an Eastern Orthodox church because where I live, there is no Eastern Orthodox church around. But I think that's, you have the church institution in general, but then you have the individual Christian brothers and sisters that are actually part of your life, and hopefully you have a few of those to keep you stable. And in reality, I think in your life you're only going to have a handful. It's not going to be a lot, especially if you're more of an introvert like me. I'm never going to have a lot. I know it's hard to believe I'm not an extrovert, but I am an introvert. After teaching high school, that was the hardest thing. After every day of talking for 6 hours, because I had to kind of put on this persona of an entertaining teacher, I'd go home and I would just, give me away. But yes, I think that division is really, really problematic, especially in today's American political, cultural situation. It's really disheartening in a lot of ways, to be serious. So
right. So what, you were a teacher, still are. What subjects ought to be taught in, let's just say high school, but aren't?
Okay. Well, it's might come out of left field, but I think a very serious answer to that would be, I think civics. It's not taught anymore, and I just our general political atmosphere in this day and age, nobody knows how the government works, and so everybody just starts screaming at each other. And I really think the American population needs a good civics course to learn how the government is supposed to work, because I think that has led to a lot of bad things in our country. Beyond that, though, I was kind of thinking about this. It was not so much what subject should be taught, but when I was in high school, the requirements weren't as strenuous, and so it gave more flexibility to take more electives. And I think that's important, because I think when I was in high school, I got to take extra art classes, and I think some of the requirements are basically your whole 4 years are plotted out where you get very little choice. And I think having more electives like art and music would be good, as well. So, for example, I know we're going to be talking about science, so I don't want to sound in the name of my book is Heresy of Ham. I don't want to sound like a scientific heretic, but I was never a big science person in high school, and I always thought, thankfully, when I was in high school, we had 2 years of science was required, like physical science and biology. But then by my junior year, I didn't have to take any more science classes, and so I took more art classes. And I was actually happy about that, because I was more artistic. I knew I wasn't going to be a scientist, and so I liked to have the option of, exploring different areas. And I think that's a good thing for students to do. Because you could probably think of a couple subjects in high school that you knew right from the start you're not going to go into. So have a couple years in that subject to get grounded in the basics, but then be freed up to to explore some other things. I think that's actually an important thing.
I wonder how many people would pass if you gave those who reside or work on Capitol Hill and in the West Wing a civics lesson.
That's the problem. A lot of our politicians don't even know how the government works. And that's why I'm so depressed over our politics these days. Regardless of your political leanings, I don't know how anybody, reasonable person can see how everything works from both sides and not get a little depressed. I'm laughing now, but I've been very depressed these last few months.
I don't know. My kids have taken advantage of the opportunity to take college courses their last 2 years of high school. And they've had all kinds of bandwidth to take fun classes and get a jump start on their major. My younger daughter is taking world drumming right now. So there's your art class.
Well, I think now a lot of high schools have connections with colleges where they can do more stuff like that. Like when I was in high school, they didn't do that, so maybe that is still available. But I think more room for exploration and creativity is a good thing, because we're creative beings, and I think that's just as important as some of the more strict classes. So that's my opinion.